CTV's political commentator Scott Reid joins us live now with his thoughts on the Prime Minister's responses to questions about his leadership. Scott, nice to see you. I just read your piece about political change. You write, most political leaders encounter change of one sort or another. A few last long enough to experience both its shine and shade. That is where Justin Trudeau now stands. 9 years ago, change was his warmest friend. Today, he suffers its coldest shoulder. I thought that was so interesting. You believe the party only has 3 options left. Tell me more.
Well, I do think it's a very significant moment. And I actually think in some ways the reaction of the Prime Minister underscores it's a serious moment because it's taken him 7-8 days since the by-election loss. He still doesn't really have a substantive answer for people, which tells you that he recognizes that in order to fill this vacuum, in order to satisfy caucus members, Liberals, in order to address Canadians' concerns, he's going to have to come up with something significant. If it isn't him leaving, it's going to have to be big change. So the 3 options really are: he could leave right away, says he isn't going to. He could leave late, says he isn't going to. And he could, in the final turn, he could deliver up a real dose of change, take a tumble, see if it's enough to melt voters' antipathy, see if he could turn the country around and reverse those polls. But that would require him to make big decisions that are very uncomfortable and of the sort that he hasn't been willing to make. I'm talking about things like bringing in a brand new economic agenda, probably bringing in a new finance minister. Certainly would mean abandoning the carbon tax, probably walking away from the deal with the NDP so that the party stands on its own, is able to look like it's more centrist rather than moving to the left. So a whole pile of elements are available to him, but it would require big choices and big change.
Right. Even if the Prime Minister steps down today, and we know it's not happening, could the Liberals even salvage what's been lost? What would it even mean for his successor, Scott?
It's really hard to tell. I mean, there are lots of historical precedents. So, most situations of this kind, government's in 9 years, it's facing a tough economy. There's nothing magical about this reversal we've seen under Justin Trudeau. People get tired of prime ministers. When Brian Mulroney went out, he was unpopular. When Pierre Trudeau went out, he was unpopular. When Jean Chrétien went out, he was unpopular. On and on and on. Stephen Harper. So in order to reverse things, you would have to have somebody who really captures the imagination of Canadians, who represents change, and is willing to follow a different path, and in particular, would be willing to take the fight to Pierre Poilievre. There is a school of thought that says, you know what, Pierre Poilievre has lots of political vulnerabilities, but people aren't willing to take a hard look at those as long as they have to peer around Justin Trudeau. So could the party renew itself? Probably not. Very tough call. Historically, the odds are stacked against him, but it's not impossible.
Scott, we're seeing this south of the border. There are calls for Joe Biden to step down. He's apparently meeting with Democratic insiders. Look, in your piece, you talk about working with a number of political leaders. How difficult is it for political leaders to take a good look in the mirror and say, okay, it's time to give it up?
It's impossibly difficult. Imagine the kind of person who doesn't sit around in a bar and says, hey, you know what, I'd make a good prime minister, but who actually sets out in life to organize themselves around the notion of getting that job, and then does. It's a certain kind of beast. And then that kind of beast does not gladly, easily, or happily give up that job. So it's very difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult for people who are prime minister, and I've worked with some of them, to conclude, you know what? I'm not the right choice now. Someone else could do this job better than me. In order to conquer my opponent, someone else other than me needs to take over. That is an extraordinarily difficult decision for leaders to make. You're watching how Joe Biden is so desperately unwilling to make it, even though he's moving into his mid-80s. So I would just say that this is the toughest conversation that any honest aide can have with their boss. And that is to say, it might be time to consider moving on.
So incredibly tough. Scott Reid, always good to be with you. Thanks for your insights.